All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Wei Huan Zhou, and I'm Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law and Justice at USW, and also a member of Herbert Smith Fairhill's China International Business and Economic Law Civil Center. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the third webinar of Civil's 2021 Global Network Conference. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I would also like to extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. This panel has a distinguished panel of speakers that joined us to talk about a very specific topic and a very important topic of today, that is international trade regulation and China. What I will do today, I will give a brief introduction to each of the panelists because none of them actually needs a substantive introduction and they are all well known in the field. And then each speaker will present for 15 minutes and that will be followed by Q&A session. So I will introduce each speaker in one go, and then I will just pass the floor to the panelists. So our first speaker is Professor Brian Mercurial. Brian is a Simon Lee Professor of Law at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He is one of the leading experts in international economic law, does a lot of work on international trade law, intellectual property rights, free trade agreements, services, as well as international investment law. And he's also an author or co-author of one of the most widely used casebook on WTO law published by Hart Publishing in 2018. He published very widely in the field and previously taught at the University of New South Wales as well. He has undertaken a number of senior roles, including consultation roles, as well as academic or other leading academic and research roles in other institutions. So our second speaker today is Professor Michael Du Ming. Professor Du is the Professor of Law at Durham University Law School in the UK and the Director of Center for Chinese Law and Policy. He's also a leading experts and has written extensively on international law and Chinese law, and including a recent monograph on the regulation of product standards in the World Trade Law, published by Hart Publishing in 2020. Our third speaker, but by no means the least, Professor Kongqing Jiang. Professor Kong has been a full professor of law since 2002. And he is currently the Dean of the School of International Law, China University of Political Science and Law. He is also the Editor-in-Chief of the Chinese Journal of Global Governance, one of the few English journals in China covers China's role in international economic legal order. He also specialized in international economic law, the WTO law, and China issues, and published more than 50 articles with international journals. And he's also author of 7 books, including 4 in English and 3 in Chinese. His recent publication has received prize from some of the leading awarding institutions. So that's, I think, sufficient introduction to our 3 distinguished speakers. The first speaker, Professor Brian Mercurial, will be talking about China's trade relations with the external world. And his topic is Frenemies in the time of global uncertainty, China's trade relations. So without further ado, let me pass the floor to Brian. Brian, the floor is yours.
Wei Wan for that introduction. It's a pleasure to join you today and to join Du Ming and Professor Kong, 2 colleagues who I have a lot of respect for, both as people and as scholars. So my title here, as you see, is Frenemies in the Time of Global Uncertainty, What is a frenemy? For those who don't know, right? It's somewhat of maybe a friend and an enemy, maybe something in between, maybe sometimes a friend, sometimes an enemy. And it seems to me that in terms of trade relations with China, so whether it be US or EU or Australia or others, this is where the relationship has headed. If you want to go to the next slide, that would be great. So what I'm going to do, because of the limited time, is actually kind of put my conclusions first, in case if I talk too long and don't actually get to them. So it's kind of an introduction, assumptions and conclusions all mixed here. And my assumption, I suppose, or starting point, is that the current root of the trade friction between China and the US and the West, really, is not new. That in fact it dates to China's accession. There were issues in China's accession to the WTO that to me were not resolved, that were bound to resurface, and really resurfaced in a big way under President Trump. But I'm saying that these differences were not really new under Trump or Obama, but really deep-seated differences that through time have revealed themselves. The second point there, I think, is that China, we know, certainly relied on the WTO norms and dispute settlement in order to solidify its model of growth, its export-oriented model of development, and of course it built huge trade surpluses doing so. It seemed to me that early on in the trade war, or as things were heating up between Trump and China, that China was actually quite scared, I think, of losing, or worried of losing the WTO, of losing dispute settlement, and what a trade war would do to it. Now, that being said, I think China emerged from that trade war feeling very different, feeling very confident, and in fact now believing it negotiates from a position of strength. The US threw really all it had at China, and China was resilient and actually strong and came out of it in a decent economic position. Now, why is that important? It's important because in future WTO negotiations, that China negotiating from a position of strength will matter. I think China is not going to be bullied. And when you hear people in Washington and maybe to a lesser extent in Brussels saying China needs to do this and China needs to do that, and these rules need to be changed, the question that's going to surface is, why would China agree to that? And if they do, what would they want in return? So I think it's really important to establish now that China is operating from a position of strength, stronger than before the trade war, in my view. So what that also says is, and it kind of leads from what I just said, China is in no rush to establish or re-establish WTO predictability. It is not going to take any offer just to get WTO predictability back. Sure, it wants MFN. Sure, it actually benefited from WTO principles. Unpredictability is not good for growth or for any trader, including Chinese. But the fact is, I think again, China is not going to be a pushover in any negotiations, and I think from my view, it's fine with that position now of uncertainty at the WTO, instead of course, just taking any of the new rules that the US and EU would want to force upon it. I think also what we see is the West viewing China as increasingly mixing trade with part of larger diplomatic, economic, and strategic relationships. Essentially, we can call this economic statecraft. That the Western view, and I think it's probably right, is that to China, trade can no longer be separated from broader diplomatic relations, and there's a lot of consequences to come from that. Now, what that means for Australia and others is that we have to be willing to accept, or at least we have to accept that there's going to be uncertainty in trade for the next few years. and there's going to be a lot of trade diversion. I don't think decoupling is an option. I think when governments talk about this, they forget the fact that in fact it's companies, mostly private companies, who trade, who embed themselves in supply chains, etc. While it's very easy to say we should decouple and establish this here or there, in practice and at the firm level, very difficult to do, and maybe doesn't make economic or strategic sense to do it. That being said, for third countries, sitting back and watching, certainly not the best option. They have to react and they have to do something, and I'll come back at the end to say what in fact that could be. The next slide, please. So I don't have to go over the trade war in any detail. I think this is a sophisticated audience and they will know it, but I just simply put on the screen a few of the main reasons why there was a trade war, reasons why the US, and to be honest, the West more broadly, have issues with China. A trade imbalance, so the deficit, China's really state-led, state capitalism model, which includes, of course, industrial subsidies, heavy use of state-owned enterprises, IP, technology transfer, exchange rates, transparency, and consistency of administrative decisions. In essence, right, it's China's failure to transition to a full market economy and the absence of, I think, political, social reforms along the way all play a part in this tension, in this case, between the China and the US. Next slide, please. Now, let's go back and see what were the expectations actually when China joined the WTO. I think the expectations for China are just increase exports, increase economic growth, reduce poverty, and I have a question mark, maybe political, social reform. I think that really depends on which official you were talking to at the time, not so much a state position. If you look at American expectations, I think it was increased peace, political reform in China, and economic reform. At the time of China's beginning of negotiations into the WTO, it of course was actually quite insignificant as an economic entity, even as an exporter. This of course changed as the negotiations went on. If we go to the next slide, if we look at why do I say those three things is what the US wanted, there's a lot of, I just have three quotes from Bill Clinton. What I think is at the highest level, the US believed that bringing China into the global economy would contribute to world peace and lead to political reform and enhanced economic opportunities for both the US and China. Now, I think the US viewed China's accession as a step in the transition from communism, authoritarianism to free market economics and democracy. And if you just look at these three quotes, and I could have put up dozens of quotes, these three quotes say that. You know, it talks about economic freedom, good for environment and labor standards, human rights, increasing benefits for China and the US, that the US can be a positive influence, that it can protect our security, that it will open new doors for America, etc. So I think there were really, as I said, kind of three main reasons the US wanted China in the WTO. Next slide. Now, if we look at expectations for economic reform, actually what we see is the exact same issues which now are the main issues in the trade war and leading to the trade friction. They are exactly the same, with the exception of the large trade deficit. But you have liberalization, IP, reduced role for state-owned enterprises, reduced use of subsidies, greater transparency, market-oriented reforms, including currency, transition away from export-oriented. They're the same. So again, the issues that led to trade war were percolating from the 1990s onwards. Next slide. Did the countries achieve their objectives. I think China, certainly for the first three, achieved all of them. For time reason, I won't go into the little sub-points there. And for the fourth one, I guess the answer is no, but it may not have actually been an objective anyway. For the US, I think there's an arguable peace dividend. I would actually say that probably has been met. The US and Chinese economies are so intertwined, I can't see them falling out in a large and militaristic way anytime soon. I hope I'm really right about that. Political reform certainly did not happen with how the US viewed or wanted it to. And I think American business and consumers did benefit, but of course this is controversial. I think sometimes there certainly are losers, middle class stagnation, working class, manufacturing jobs, certainly probably losers. That being said, the winners, I think, sometimes don't recognize their winners. The ability to buy cheaper, high quality products, etc. I think overall the US has actually won, but they may not see themselves as winning. Next slide. So these criticisms kind of continue against China from a variety of states, both at and outside the WTO. We can kind of break them down to high-level criticisms and specific, but a lot of it really repeats on what I said. I think one of the interesting points to really further explore, which I won't do now, is China actually acting that differently to others? Is China acting differently, or is it being treated differently because of its size and its economic and now actually geopolitical power? Next slide. I want to get to, I want to say something fairly substantial here, so I skipped through the last one fairly quickly. If we look at China and economic power, I think the way I see it, and I think the way the West sees it, is really China moved probably around 2008 from kind of an observer at the WTO to a leader. I say reluctant leader because I'm not sure that China wanted the leadership role. I think it was very happy to stay in the shadows, keep the status quo, not rock the boat, and really keep winning as a WTO member. Now clearly in that position, and I would maybe go as so far to say that there's really a G2 of the US and China, although I think European colleagues may not like that too much. Indian and Brazilian perhaps as well. I think that China really understands that many economies, both developed and developing, are almost wholly dependent on it for economic growth. And what that means, again, is that China, I think, will champion certain causes, but remains really cautious about speaking for, say, the developing world. This is unlike, of course, India and Brazil. And while it wholeheartedly defends its interest at the WTO, I call it with aggressive legalism, meaning always resorting to rules to counter every charge against it. It hasn't actually pushed many offensive interests. We see this in intellectual property. I think people thought that China was going to challenge the system, and they certainly have not. China has been challenging. They have been a challenging member, but they certainly have not taken the road of India and Brazil in arguing against really almost any form of IP right. They instead defend every measure on the basis of rules and legislation. We see that now in the trade dispute with Australia. Most if not all measures being defended on the basis of trade remedies or SPS measures, etc. In that, again, China's defending every interest, saying don't look at the whole, look at each measure independently. Now that leads to the last point here. China is increasingly being accused of mixing foreign policy and trade, and that really trade is now just a small component in a diplomatic game. We can go back and say this happened with Norway and Canada, Australia. Perhaps the EU is the next one, because EU-China relations right now are rather frosty since the beginning of this year. We can go to the next slide. I want to say, and I think this is quite an important slide, if you look at the result of increasing trade friction with Australia. Australia's tons of coal per month sent to China was 3 million tons in 2020, October 2020. The US sent none. By December, Australia was sending none, and the US was sending coal to China, and over 500,000 tons by March. Now, what does that mean? Actually, we can go to the next slide, and I'll come back to what that means. What can countries do? I guess I'll just say trade diversion is occurring. Okay, with that last slide, what we see is trade diversion is occurring. As trade frictions are rising, we see trade diversion. I could have picked 15 different products involving Australia and China trade. I just put up the nice one with coal. I think the idea that countries will group together to try to take on China is a fallacy. There really is no grouping together. So in a dispute, I think countries cannot expect others to back them. It's going to be very difficult for a government to say to a farmer, don't send these goods to China because they did something to the US that we don't like. I think that's going to be, actually, it's just not in the realm of possibility. And I think China knows that, okay? So what can countries do and firms do? I think what I conclude by saying is unpredictability is going to remain for some time. A return to the WTO is some years away, and it hits on that point I made with the first slide. China is not simply going to take what the West and Japan put forward. So we have to look at two things. What can we do to make China agree to changes, and what will China want in return? We have to understand that, and I think actually from a Western point of view, I don't think Western countries understand that. I don't even think they're asking the questions. Almost everything I see coming out of Washington and Brussels is simply they need to change, but not the how, why, and not the why or the how can we do that. Second point I already said, basically, I think this idea of a NATO for trade or an alliance is not realistic. Third, if your countries play the game and companies secure as many market access opportunities as possible, but don't assume these are permanent. Encourage diversification. I know that's easier said than done, because as we see when trade conflicts happen, diversion will happen. So we can't assume those gains are permanent. Continue domestic reforms. Try to usurp leadership as a middle power like Australia. Actually, now is the time, I think, that they can have a greater role in influencing high quality FTAs and niche agreements. Try to influence the US, EU, Japanese position, etc. I think, again, sitting back and watching is not an option. Plan, move, be prepared for a bumpy road, but be in a position to try to take advantage of the chaos which will ensue. I think I'll stop there, and thank you, Professor Zhou, and everyone for listening.
Thanks, Brian. That's very fantastic. I think setting out the theme and also the broad picture for this panel. Now, I think what you concluded really resounded with me, which is about really about why I organized this panel and focused on the topic about the Western views and China's views, and also from the WTO's perspective. Essentially, it tries to really looking at what actually the Western world, especially the major partners, US, EU, wanted to see in the current world, and also giving China's rising power, as you correctly identified and explained, but also about what China actually may want to do or can actually offer or put on the table as a compromise. And thirdly, about what the role the WTO may actually play to facilitate cooperation and managing the conflicts. So I will raise my questions after all the panelists have spoken. But on my last point about the role of the WTO, I'm happy to hand it over to Professor Du Ming to talk about the impact or the lack of impact of international economic law. Professor Du, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yuhuan. Thank you for your very kind invitation and introduction. It's a great delight for me to share a panel with my longtime colleagues and friends, Brian and Professor Kong, and both have a relation for many years. What I'm going to present today is based on an article and Dean Kong and I wrote not long ago. So with his generous permission, I will present to the audience our collective thinking, and Dean Kong will present another important topic, which you will hear shortly. But I would like to highlight his contribution to the piece we have co-authored. Now, the topic I'm going to say today is China and the limits of international economic law. Brian just provided us with a fantastic introduction and analysis of the complexities of the China problem. Now, what I will do is to take a step back and reflect on how we have got to the situation we are witnessing today and the limits of international economic law in addressing the problem at hand. Now, Dean Kong and my interest was triggered precisely by Brian just described back in 1990s. Basically, I'm saying two contrasting narratives. Back in 1990s, when Western countries debated whether should allow China to join the WTO, I think one important supporting argument, and that is the popular one, as Brian said, saying that integrating China into the liberal international economic order would not only boost international trade and investment, but will have some larger aims, that is economic and political change, and more specifically, market economy and the rule of law. And it was partly because at least partly because of this optimism across the political spectrum in the West that China joined the WTO back in 2001, and that was the defining moment for China's economic rise we are seeing today. Now, if we compare the narrative back in 1990s to what we are seeing today, and the contrast is stark. And I will not go over all the dramas we have seen. Just think of all sorts of problems between Australia and China in trade, in human rights, in COVID-19, or whatever. A lot of issues are involved there. Now, the new narrative is China has benefited enormously from integrated into liberal international economic order, but contrary to what the West had anticipated, China has not shifted to market economy and the rule of law, and China has selectively chosen those international norms which will help its economic growth and preferred by its political elites, but at the same time resisted economic and political reform in the larger forms. Now, and also at the same time, China has used its Belt and Road and Made in China 2025 to spread its authoritarian features. Now let's reflect on these two contrasting narratives on the impact of international economic norms on state change at domestic level. And we asked the question, what went wrong? And why the ideas on the interaction between international norms and state change have shifted so drastically over a very short span of time. We are talking about less than 1 decade. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, it's easy for us to blame politicians back 20 years ago as too naive, because they have based very important policy decisions on some wishful thinking. But again, that criticism is not fair, because if you think about it, that thinking just that I described, because the policy the West have made over the past 20 years was based on very distinguished thinking across the different disciplines in social sciences. Now, at first, it goes like this, saying that both WTO law and international investment law, they represent a new liberal paradigm. We have, because the whole world trading system has shifted from embedded liberalism to a liberal term since 1980s, and then And then the WTO membership and the investment treaties are therefore a channel through which those neoliberal thinking neoliberal thinkings and good governance will be transferred to China. And for a state like China, with a long history of official intervention into all walks of life, and the neoliberal paradigm challenges the core ideas of the role of government in society. And therefore, the introduction of China into the neoliberal economic system is part of a larger strategy of economic and political reform. So in the end, international economic law will not only bolster trade, but also increase accountability and also individual rights. Now, looking around, we find that this narrative at a very general level is supported by different disciplines. For example, we have been told that international economic norms, WTO rules, and also international investment treaties have sort of socializing effect. They teach states what good behavior, how to be a good citizen in international society, and also decisively influence their domestic policies. We are also being told that China WTO membership will orient China towards a market economy. But when China wants a market economy, it must have a rule of law. Otherwise, the foreign capital will flee and will have a significant impact on foreign trade. We are also told, I'm sure you have heard a lot of times, that after China has become a member of WTO, it will be difficult for China to renege on its commitments without incurring significant political and economic costs. And at the same time, the reform-minded leaders will somehow use the WTO at the external level to push domestic reforms. Therefore, they lock in their reforms and further domestic economic and political reforms. Now, a second, if you also, when China joined WTO, the Western countries have inserted in WTO accession protocol a wide range of discriminatory so-called WTO plus obligations, and many of us have written on the notorious analog country methodology, anti-dumping regulations, etc. Now, third, we cannot deny the positive impact of international economic engagement on China. Empirical evidence has shown that in China, in those regions where rule of law is better realized, are those where foreign investment and foreign trade have played a larger role in economic development. For example, the coastal regions and also big cities. Now, therefore, the issue is not about the positive impacts of international economic law on China. The real problem is the degree, is the depth and the scope of such effect. Now, our main argument is that the catalyst function of international economic law in promoting market economy and the rule of law or even democratic reforms has been overestimated for too long. The academic discourse and the policy decision-making based on grand narratives that I just described have glossed over a lot of important issues. Now, I will talk about three limits of international economic law in addressing the problem at hand. Now, first, I want to broadly, say this limited mandate of international trade law and investment. Very contrary to all those optimism about how international economic law promote market economy reform and the rule of law. Actually, if you look at the content of laws, they have very little to say about political, legal, or even economic systems. What domestic economic political system you should have, and there's nothing to say about it. And second, there's a growing consensus that the current international economic norms are ill-equipped to constrain China's unique economic model. If you look at the current practice, in some of China's problems are addressed through a very long and costly WTO litigation. But for many other problems, they fall into gray areas. They are either no direct WTO rules, or no, there are no WTO rules talk about it, or it's all the relevant rules are quite ambiguous. And it was again, it's not new, because think about the WTO rules. They were written several decades ago, and the drafters of WTO agreements clearly, when they wrote the rule book, they didn't have a state-led economy in their mind. Now, a good example is China's state-owned enterprises. If you look at current international trade and investment rules, they basically have a quite clear distinction of public and private, have a clear differentiate of sovereign act and commercial acts. But if you apply them to the Chinese state-owned enterprises, you can see that it's a hybrid economic entity. It's both public and private. It practices commercial acts, but you don't know whether there's political end to it or not. Therefore, it's difficult to apply the current rules. Now, the second point is, again, it's the limits of dispute settlement in international economic disputes. Now, WTO appellate body is now dysfunctional, but if you look at the investor state arbitration system, and China has signed more than 150 international investment agreements, but so far, only 2 or 3 records, 2 or 3 cases were lodged against China, and China has won all the cases. So basically, the SDS has very limited impact on China. So a lot of explanations were offered saying why China has so little exposure to SDS. Now, one explanation says it's precisely because of the lack of rule of law in China. So foreign investors know that if they launch a suit against China, that probably means the end of their business dealings with China. Therefore, they prefer the non-adversarial means such as negotiation and also mediation to solve the problem and gain more behind the table rather than use official SDS system. Now, the last point I want to say is the flawed international economic engagement and state change assumptions. Now, again, in hindsight, much of original optimism back in 1990s and early 2000s was based on a flawed assumption. In particular, it implicitly assumes that China will be docile, China will be receptive to all globalization, economic forces, external influences. But and their national policies and identities will somehow easily molded along liberal democratic alliance. Well, it is theoretically possible, but it's not a guaranteed outcome. The alternative possibility, which we are seeing today, is China has selectively internalized some of the norms without transforming its political and economic system. It's easy to understand why this is the case, because this is basically said and repeated in Chinese media on a daily basis. That's because of the Chinese Communist Party leadership. As a one-party state, the regime's survival is the party's #1 priority. International economic engagement is welcomed and embraced only when it operates within party's political lines. The party does not allow economic globalization to threaten its role in China. When it sees the threat, it will stop it. Now, to conclude, the current controversy about China is in essence a conflict of 2 fundamentally different political and economic models. We traditionally conceptualize international economic law as providing an interface where different political economic models can somehow smooth over their differences and coordinate their trade and economic relations. But now, in a new era, it's clear that the role of international law in solving the problems at hand is minimal. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. Thanks, Wei Huan.
Thanks, Michael. That's very insightful, I would say. Some of what I have said actually reflected on some of the claims about how much the system or the multilateral trading system can do about China's economic reforms. And I think that's aligned with what Brian was saying very well. Now, I will come back to you with the question after Professor Kong has spoken about what we can do within that limit, right? And if we can't do anything within that limit, what will be the alternative? So I will come back to you with that question, and you may elaborate a little bit more about your thoughts. Now, with the limit of the international economic law, and we're looking into the future, right? And Professor Kong will be talking to us from mainly Chinese perspective, and to really dig out the current reforms and the future of Chinese policy. And his presentation is titled, "Will China Have a New Agenda for Trade in the Post-Pandemic Era?" The only thing I would change is really add a bracket on post-pandemic, the posts, because I think China is changing trade policy, changing economic policy within the pandemic. That's ongoing at the moment. But with that, the floor is yours, Professor Kong.
Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to talk about whether China will have a new trade agenda in the post-pandemic era. First of all, I would like to introduce you the official discourse on great changes unseen in the century. And this is a new term which was firstly coined by the General Secretary Xi Jinping in June 2018. He said, "The world today is undergoing great changes unseen in the century," at the Central Foreign Affairs World Conference. Since then, this term has been officially used to describe the international strategic configuration. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah. According to the CPC's tradition, the content of great change unseen in the century has not been clearly defined, has never been clearly defined. Nevertheless, the official speeches delivered by senior officials and academic articles have tried to interpret it in their own way. According to them, great changes unseen in the century is to be understood as an increasingly uncertain and complex international environment in which the country will seek to achieve its goals. Next slide, please. The international configuration is characterized by a diffusion of power away from the dominant powers. Certainly, that's referring to the United States, and which is also associated with so-called a rising East and a declining West. Next slide, please. Of course, here East is referred to Asia or emerging economies, or specifically to China, and West is referred to developed world with the United States as its leader, or specifically to the United States. Next slide. Rising East and declining West actually has been evidenced by the remarkable economic growth of China since the 2008 financial crisis. And this have given rise to a change in the balance of power between China and the United States. And this possibly has led the United States to view China as a primary strategic competitor. Next slide. As time goes by, great changes unseen in the century was conveniently used to interpret the growing tensions between the United States and China. And this started with the trade disputes and then spilled over to other areas like science and technology. In the wake of the outbreak of COVID-19, the huge impact of pandemic on the international pattern was also observed with this magic prism, great changes unseen in a century. Next slide. From the perspective of Chinese leadership, the great changes unseen in a century, an outbreak of coronavirus pandemic have superimposed. Due to this, the world has entered a period of turbulent change, and China has become more and more confident of itself. And this has been related to so-called full confidence discourse, namely full confidence in the path, in the theory, in the system of Chinese socialism, as well as the Chinese culture. So the country is becoming more and more confident of itself because of the so-called great changes unseen in the century. The perception that the Chinese system is superior to that of the United States was even made visible. Previously, great changes primarily is related to the balance of power, economic power. Now, a new perception has gained prominence, that is, the Chinese system is superior to that of the United States. And this was made even visible during the pandemic, when the US was seen in a chaos and an even disastrous state, and China had successfully kept the pandemic under control. Next slide, please. Now, having said that, what is the implication of great changes as seen in the century for international trade rules in the mind of Chinese leadership? What is the Chinese perception of its role in the new landscape of international trade rules? Next slide. China indeed has seen this great changes and seen in the century, can see this as a time for reshaping of the global order, and seen this as an opportunity for playing a bigger role in this regard. Next slide. China has found there is a governance deficit. There were governance deficit, and seeing this as presenting new opportunity, and the country is actively participating in reform and the building of the global governance system. And this is the theme which was highlighted by the Party Congress report. Xi himself, on various occasions, called for a bigger role of China in international economic and trade rulemaking. That's his strong aspiration, I believe. Next slide. Next slide, please. China has found its limit. It has its limit. It has found that from GATT era to the WTO era, the US has always been the driving force of any major change in the making of international trade rules. No other but US was the driving force of any international rulemaking. In contrast, even though the power of emerging economies, including China, has been risen, but the capability of China to participate in rulemaking leaves sufficient room to be improved. So it's not enough to lead the process of a new rulemaking agenda. Next slide, please. Again, this backdrop, China, I think, is quietly clear, has realized that it's not in the position to change the overall landscape of international trade rules. And it's not China's intention to overturn the current system of international trade rules. And this, please note, this was repeated by Xi himself on numerous occasions. It's not an intention to overthrow the current system. Now, then let's see what is the prospect of China's behavior in international rulemaking. In general, I think it can be anticipated that China will work hard to maintain the existing multilateral trading system with the WTO as the center. The WTO trading system, the world trading system, provides China and other countries with a fair, reasonable, and a transparent economic environment. I think this is something that China is clearly aware of. Next slide. For the country, any change towards the international trade rules will be made on the basis of a current WTO system. China will actively promote its reform agenda, reform proposal, which had been raised 2 years ago, and will uphold the multilateral trading system as it understands. Next slide. Of course, in this course, the country will have its own assessment of overall international configuration. And I think it will take into account of its capacity. Therefore, it's very natural for the country to align with the developing countries to change or to move forward the reform. And that's why it has been very consistent in supporting the special and differentiated treatment of developing countries. And what it's doing is supporting and augmenting the voice and representation of developing countries. And it's calling for democratization of international relations in the trade context. Next slide, please. China's status as a developing country, particularly China's status as a market economy, has often been questioned. And the country sees it as a special form of discrimination against itself. On the other hand, China has noticed the US and its allies have been doing what it takes to contain China. And a new word has been used in this regard, that is so-called block by rules. So the US is deploying international trade rules, and particularly in the regional trade agreements. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Xi himself called for resolutely safeguarding national sovereignty, security, and development interests, to stand up to the attempts of the US to block China by rules. And China's top diplomat Yang Jiechi also said on a few occasions, he called for properly responding to economic frictions and safeguarding the country's development space and a long-term interest. I think he basically is referring to China shall be standing up to those attempts to lock China by rules. Yeah. In this context, China has remained alert to the prospect that the US, in alliance with its allies, aspire to incorporate such rules in the multilateral context. For the rise in China, I think the first priority is to prevent such discriminatory rules from being made against itself in the multilateral context. And it seems it has the capacity to block such attempt, particularly in consideration of the consensus decision-making in the WTO. Next slide. China will promote desired rulemaking through flexible, pragmatic, and open multilateralism. That is referred to making rules, plurilateral rules with certain countries. So China will mobilize certain number of countries in order to promote its desired rules. For example, the country has already proposed a so-called investment facilitation agreement. I think this agreement, this proposed agreement has received received welcome by a big number of countries. I think this country will do whatever it can to promote its desired rules, even though in the plurilateral agreements, in the form of plurilateral agreement. Next slide, please. And again, China will foster implementation of free trade area strategy. That is a strategy to embrace other countries, particularly regional countries, for free trade agreements. And I believe more free trade agreements will be negotiated between China and selected trade partners, particularly those countries that participate in the Belt and Road construction will be right partners for free trade agreements. And you certainly know RCEP has been concluded, even though it's under auspices of the ASEAN countries, but China is a keen supporter, was a keen supporter. And I think possibly the country is considering expansion of the RCEP, which is made available by the RCEP rules. China, more importantly, China will actively consider the feasibility of acceding to the CPTPP, which is certainly the predecessor is the TPP initiated by, or at least sponsored by the US. So China is considering acceding to the CPTPP. This, I think, it is a tremendous step. On the other hand, it will continue upgrading or renegotiating bilateral investment agreements. There is always a network of bilateral investment agreements, and the country, I think, is going to upgrade or renegotiate such agreements on the basis of pre-established national treatment, which has been enshrined by the foreign investment law. After saying that, let's come to the concluding remarks. As its economic rise in relation to the relative declining of the West, China is becoming more confident of its system and as well as its capacity. Its capacity to handle the pandemic in a proper manner while keeping its economic growth has consolidated this perception. The phenomenon labeled as great changes unseen in a century further spurs its ambition for a bigger role in international trade rulemaking. Next slide. However, it has realized the current WTO framework is in its interest, and it has its limit in shaping the trade rules. China has also noticed the US and its allies are forging new sets of rules for so-called non-market economy. Again, this backdrop, China's trade agenda is modest. Upholding the current multilateral trading system is at its center, promoting its desirable rules as far as it can, and mostly in a plurilateral approach, pursuing systemic interests while aligning with developing countries, as well as nurturing regional trade rules in the context of Belt and Road Initiative and the Free Trade Area Strategy. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Kong. We understand that the internet connection at your end has been very unstable, and we really appreciate you tried very hard to really reconnect to us and to manage the connection problems. And to the audience, we apologize if this hasn't been very clear, but I think the slides are very powerful and clear. And also we will try to ask Professor Kong whether he wants to record his presentation again so we can actually put online for our audience. And finally, welcome to the real world of virtual conference. Now, I want to open up the Q&A session and to kind of exercise my my right as the chair to ask 3 questions, related questions to each of the speakers. Each of the speakers has touched upon this and also give us a very high level discussion of some of the issues from outside of China, in China. But my question is really something I have thought about for a long time, but I couldn't really find an answer. So I want to really ask the opinions from our panelists. I guess the starting point is that to see the core issue between China and the Western or China-US, either tensions or ongoing frictions, if you like, has been China's state capitalism or China's unique model, as some scholars have called, for economic development. So my question is, what exactly China's trading partners, particularly from the US and EU perspective, expect China to do or reform in relation to this fundamental issue? And I think Brian has touched mainly upon the external perspective. So this question goes to Brian. And the next question, which is related. So having talked about the external views on how China may change its economic system, or what extent that China is expected to do so. And the second question to Professor Kong is, given these expectations, to what extent China may be willing to make such changes? And for those 2 questions, for us to see whether there might be a meeting of minds or compromise. And the third question is, if there is a possibility for a compromise, what role the WTO may play realistically in facilitating such cooperation or compromise to be achieved, and how the potential role or impact of the WTO compares with other approaches, for example, at the bilateral or plurilateral levels. And I think this question goes to Professor Du. He has been talking about the limit of the WTO system. So, Brian, I'll start with you.
Look, it's a great question, and as I said, I think in some respects that if we are looking at a WTO bargain or at a trade governance bargain, I think this hasn't really been fully thought out. Now, in trade conflict ways, and in we do see what is emerging, and we see in the EU agreement with China what is emerging. So, I mean, the pie in the sky thinking would, of course, be, well, we want China to change its model of state capitalism and state-led development. I mean, if anyone thinks that that's reality, then they are really in for a cold shower or a cold bath, because I think that that's not really going to happen whatsoever. Now, so that thinking is, though, if we break it down, we can say, well, what are they really saying? They're saying that the state-led development model unfairly benefits Chinese companies. Let's just say that. Now, I think at the early stage, we heard it from the it unfairly benefits Chinese exporters. But now I think what we're seeing is it unfairly benefits, Chinese companies vis-a-vis the domestic market as well. I think that's becoming more and more important. So if we again say, well, what does that mean? Obviously, subsidy and reforms of subsidies to SOEs is the number one issue which has been in the spotlight. Some sort of reform. I think that's going to be, and maybe Professor Kong can answer, right? What would China be willing to give for that? But I really think that we're at a stage that the US, EU, and I would say Japan really won't settle for anything less than some form of change there. I think the second thing we certainly see the West wanting is the market access improvements. I think two areas we see that, services and agriculture are the two big areas that we see requests for enhanced market access reform. And maybe we can kind of wrap that up as well with a third category of improved business climate. And that's a broad category which hits on kind of the transparency and administrative decisions, etc. I haven't really seen it so much in coming directly from governments, but I think in one hand, the relationship between the central government and the provincial level is creates some uncertainties for Western businesses, and I think the businesses and the government don't really understand all of those differences. Now, I think, quite encouragingly, we see China react to this recently with the still rather new investment law, which prohibits the imposition of technology transfer. I think there was a disconnect between the central government saying we have no law which mandates or requires technology transfer, and maybe what was happening at the lower level. Now, of course, we actually have a pretty clear directive in the form of legislation. So I think actually in some sense it's transparency and making clear the differences, but also harmonizing maybe in China. So I would say subsidy reform, market access, and business climate are probably the three main areas that Western businesses and governments would like to see improvement on.
Thanks, Brian. Professor Kong, did we lost Professor Kong? All right. Michael, maybe I'll start with you, and while we're waiting for Professor Kong to rejoin.
Sure. Yep. So, can you hear me? Thank you. Okay, thank you. Both US and China, including European Union, are looking for all sorts of forums and means to solve the problem. Multilateral, WTO, plurilateral, bilateral, or whatever, Belt and Road, or whatever ways. I think they will take a collective, they will look at all the options on the table. They will not say prioritize one over another. I think they will a comprehensive approach. Second point is, I do not have a very high hopes for the WTO. Look at WTO, the main functions: negotiation and dispute settlement. Negotiation function has been kind of dead for many years since Doha round, and WTO pet body is dysfunctional. So what realistically what can hope from WTO? Then compared to WTO, a bilateral and plurilateral probably more hold more hopes. For example, we have seen the phase one US-China deal. We have seen the US-European Union KAI, but still you can be cynical about it. You can say, look, these current agreements basically recycling a lot of China past commitments. Partly it's true, but still there's some new things there. So you can see things are moving rather than stand still. The third point is, but even we say bilateral and plurilateral compared to WTO hold more promise, I wouldn't be too optimistic about it for a number of reasons. Now, firstly, for a number of reasons, the first reason is nobody knows. We are talking about we want to reach a compromise, but where is the end? What is a compromised position in people's mind? Nobody knows. For example, you ask a question, I think Brian answered pretty well, that's we need to ask the question, where do you want to go? I mean, there should be an end, but where's the end? What will China do to make European Union and the US satisfied? And what China can do? These are nobody knows where the end position is. And therefore, nobody knows, it takes time to solve the problem. And second, if you look at, this is a systemic issue. So basically, there are some issues seem to be unbridgeable. And for example, you are talking about Chinese state-owned enterprises, and you are talking about industrial policies. But look, Chinese state-owned enterprises, they provide the material and the ideological foundation for the CCP, for the China Communist Party. If you look at industrial policies, and China sees it as a unique strength, and this is part of the integral part of China model. So therefore, SOE's industry policies, for many years, China used them very well, both to achieve economic growth and also political stability. Now you are saying, I don't want you to have that. Basically, you see, you have to find where China's core interests are and where the red line you cannot cross. If you cross the line, basically, people walk away and everybody says, I speak from position of strength. That is kind of, and also, and deeper than that, it's not a legal issue. Deeper than that, it's a value conflict. It's a value conflict. For example, when Chinese SOEs invest abroad, why West countries are worried about it? Because, for example, UK said, look, we spent many years back in 1980s privatize our own state-owned enterprises, but now the state-owned enterprises come back and renationalize our privatized assets. We don't want that. So this is a value conflict. And also the deep issue of trust. Even China says, okay, I want to reduce the size of SOEs. I want to reduce the industrial policies. But, do you really trust that? That's, that kind of also deep issue of trust in international relations. And also even look at the issue from even larger picture. We are talking about a big rivalry. And we are talking about, as Dean Kung said, rising of the East, declining of the West, old powers, new powers, and everybody sees who is number one. It's a systemic rivalry. And therefore, again, this is the things we are talking today is a very small part of a large puzzle. So I think that is the root problem we are talking about. Therefore, we are talking about the rule of international law. We are talking about how do we change the international trade investment norms. I mean, that's probably only the surface of the tip of the iceberg we are talking about today. Thank you. Thank you, Wei-Huan.
Thanks, Michael. And that's very comprehensive and thoughtful. As Professor Kong is still reconnecting, I would ask you guys to fill the gap about the question I asked Professor Kong, and perhaps just have a little bit conversation about what you have said. I think it's a fundamental issue, and the audience will be interested in your views about how you actually respond to what you have answered my question, and also how you think that, because I take from you, Mike, it's a little bit kind of a pessimistic view about what the WTO can do, or whether there will be kind of a meeting of minds, especially when it comes to value. So I wonder to what extent China may actually agree to some changes. Now, you mentioned the phase 1 deal, you mentioned KAI, and we know KAI is not going well at the moment. But from my perspective, I think KAI still is the first agreement China agreed to some rules on SOEs. And when you come back to phase 1 deal, I mean, pretty much what China have already agreed in other contexts, including the WTO, have been actually incorporated into the phase 1 deal, apart from, the very managed trade section of it. So I was wondering, what exactly, I mean, maybe some examples about what exactly China may actually agree to.
That's a question to Brian or to me?
To both of you. I will count on you to fill the gap that Professor is still reconnecting. So if you can share some further views and join in the conversation, and that would be great. Thanks. Maybe I start with Brian.
Okay, sure. Look, I hate to be a pessimist as well, but as I did say, I think we're some years away from returning to the WTO in some sense. And that, maybe just to flesh out some of the things I said about what that means of uncertainty and trade diversion, I think, and Michael hit on it, the phase one deal between the US and China actually had a number of important provisions in it. Let's just take the purchase commitments on agriculture and other energy and other purchase requirements. That's actually really worrying development. And it is a worrying development because it's not a free trade agreement as we know. It's managed trade. It's a return to essentially, you could even say, kind of quota-like system. And of course, what it will encourage others to do is then to grab their share, right? Others to now say, well, I need to maybe negotiate with China and get something as well, and I need to get my quota. I think this is, it is reversing the, 70 plus years we've had of building the system on MFN. And yes, we've diverted from it with free trade agreements really a lot in the last 20 or so years. But that's the bedrock of the system. And there was a purpose for having that as the bedrock, that and national treatment. We saw what happened in the 1930s when countries, undertook their own strategies for their own benefit. No one ended up benefiting. So I'm really actually quite concerned at these agreements. And I think, and I was talking to many other governments at the time of the US negotiating this deal with China, and they all wanted the trade war between China and the US to resolve, but they were all worried about how it would resolve and what it would mean. And, in financial services, does this mean the next, 10 changes that China makes are going to benefit American companies and not others? And I think that kind of, if that's the way we're going with bilateralism, to kind of niche agreements that may target some sectors or what have you, then it's really, really quite a problematic future. Now, to return to your actual question, what which I think is what China can give. That was the question, right? Where can China see these landing spots? I think it's going to be very difficult. I might have to just return on the points I made before. It's very clear, China's going to have to give something if, in fact, it wants that strong multilateral system. I think China's best case scenario is let's return to 2016. Let's return to the status quo of 2016. And given that we've had a trade war and a pandemic, I think actually all of us would like to return to 2016 as well. We'd all be younger, but this would be actually the ideal. But I think that's not likely, right? That's not going to happen because others are not going to accept that. I think that the danger for, not danger, the issue for China is actually going to be to make meaningful offers that others actually think are meaningful and not just cynical about. I think China does not have a lot of, built up credibility in the sense. I think the West views China as making a proposal and thinking that it's very mercantilist and they're going to agree to this, but they've already got ways around it. And if that's how your negotiating partner views you, actually, even when you're negotiating in good faith, it's hard to convince them of that. So this is my pessimism. Even if China makes great market access, offers in services, agriculture, and others, will that be good enough? Or will its negotiating partners say, we're just not sure because something else is going to come up which is going to block that? As I said, I think subsidy reform is going to be absolutely necessary. This is going to be a very difficult issue. And certainly, as I said before, China is going to have to get something in return. And what is it going to want in return? And that's the perfect point in time to pass it to my friend and colleague, Duming, who can answer that question.
Brian, I think I agree with you. I agree with all what you said. That's very insightful. I just want to add a couple of additional points up to my. Okay, now I think I'm coming back, right? Okay, so I just want to add a couple of quick points. I agree with all Brian has said, very insightful. I'm a pessimist, but still I want to point out some silver lining. Point out some silver lining. So paradoxically, if you see, I think a number of issues here. Both sides are experimenting. For example, if you ask China, what can you change, what you cannot change, I don't think even China knows. I give you one example, reform of state-owned enterprises. If you ask what the West wants, they want, okay, competitive neutrality.
I think Mike is rejoining. Let's give him a bit time. Michael,
okay,
good to have you back.
Sorry.
No, that's all right.
I think, yeah. So my point is, I think China is also looking for its boundary. China does not hold any definitive positions on many things. State-owned enterprises is one example. If you look at what the West wants, they want competitive neutrality, they want level playing field, and they do not want discrimination against foreign investors. But if you look at Chinese government policies, at least on paper, the Chinese government also wants SOEs to be independent market entities. They also want that. Therefore, at least on paper, their interests converge. The problem is, how do you do that? How do it takes some time. You need to grow towards the goal. At least on paper, you have a shared goal. But still, historical reasons, ideological reasons, China need to make sure that that SOE still provide material foundation for its rule. So I mean, there's some, I would say, China is also growing towards the end. At a certain point, there must be a compromised position. We don't know where it is, because it must be. Because even at I always say the Cold War is better than hot war, right? Because if we do not expect anything worse, then you have to reach a compromised position. I think China is flexible, China is resilient, but the bottom line is, whatever measures you propose, it's important to convince China that is not only for our interest, West interest, but also for China interest, right? For example, SOEs, industrial policies, we need to point out they are inefficient. If you do not have that, actually your economic growth will be even more impressive, or that's actually hurt your own interest if you insist on certain policies. I think the people are rational. Let's be, even China side and the US side, I think both are rational. They are very smart people. They understand if the argument is convincing, I think there's somehow some compromise can be reached at a certain point. But still, I mean, I agree with Brian. Probably, let's take some years to do that. But but there's something must be done. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I can see you coming a little bit back to optimism, right? So I really share that optimistic view. I think there will be somewhere that they're gonna grant, and people will actually come up with some interesting, innovative, but also very reasonable ideas. Brian, I think you want to have.
Yeah, can I just add in? I mean, two things. The one is, and we're seeing it in the last few weeks. This, I guess, distrust or skepticism of China. So the crackdown on the tech industry in China. I certainly have no idea, why it happened, but if we say, and a narrative is, of course, well, this is China strengthening the competitive environment and realizing that actually it can be more innovative. They've reached a point that, in fact, this may stifle innovation to have these leaders as opposed to encourage it. Now, this is actually what other countries do as well. I mean, for the exact same reasons. But I think what we see is when China does it, there's an immediate skepticism from almost everybody who's writing about it to say, this is a consolidation of power exercise, et cetera, et cetera. Now, who knows? It may well be. But that being said, up until this point, China's been criticized for providing support to these tech companies, for essentially not letting the market drive, and for essentially cheating. And now that they've taken action, we will also criticize. I think that is just an illustration of sometimes, regardless of what China does, it's kind of viewed in a negative way, immediate response. Now, I mean, to go on to Michael's point here, I think you're right, and I'll be somewhat optimistic as well. And why I'll be somewhat optimistic is where I think deals can be done, and we've seen it with the Phase 1 deal, and we've seen it with the CAI, which, despite being called the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, is not comprehensive, nor is it an actually agreement on investment. It actually includes a lot of services in there. I think what this shows is at a bilateral level, deals can be made. So I'm actually not worried that at a bilateral level, China and the US can make another deal if it comes to that, or China and even Australia at this point, even though it's rather frosty relations. I'm a little more skeptical, though, that at the multilateral level, we're going to get this agreement among the many. So actually, maybe that benefits the main players. They don't have to worry about India holding up things. They don't have to worry about others. But in fact, as I say, I am worried about what it does to the multilateral system, and I'm worried for third countries, the kind of the countries who don't negotiate with the US or China in this agreement. They will actually be harmed here.
Thanks, Brian. My optimistic expectation has always been that any bilateral deal will actually contribute to a more inclusive negotiation. But obviously we haven't seen that happening. Yeah, I've taken into account the questions put in by the participants. So some of the questions or discussions just now have covered many of these questions in the Q&A section. But there are some other questions which I wouldn't ask you to answer, but I will just flag it for you to think about, because people ask difficult questions beyond what is already a very difficult situation negotiating about industry subsidies and SOEs. But people also ask questions about view on human rights, currency manipulation. So those kind of old and emerging issues that will actually come into play. But I mean, that will take us another hour to discuss. But so, to kind of close this session, I really want you to reflect on a very important initiative, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. I understand that both of you have written about it in the past. I'm not really interested in what happened, but I want to hear your views about, and this is also some questions in the audience, about what role of Belt and Road Initiative may play in the future. And how would that actually continue to impact on China's role in the world, and particularly the US-China relationship. Brian, can I start with you?
If you insist. It's a tough question, and I think again it's a topic on its own. I was just thinking, you know, in the one hand, you can look at this as a way simply to encourage, you know, economic progress, right? It can serve as a form to encourage outward investment. It can serve as a form to encourage or to maybe take production from, whether it's cement, steel, etc., employment. You know, so in one way, it of course can serve as a way to help continue drive Chinese growth. That being said, of course, most other countries know, and as I said, China knows that they're quite dependent on Chinese for their own economic growth. So it's actually a way to propel that. So in best case scenario, it's win-win. Now, I think, you know, what we also can talk about is the geopolitical significance, and which I think is the more interesting angle. And I think if China does this right, and to be honest, sometimes in soft power, I think China actually gets it wrong quite a lot, and doesn't realize why it gets it wrong. But actually, this could serve geopolitically, if China does things right here, then actually it can serve as a platform for a shifting, you know, international relations spectrum, you know, to pull into orbit, if you want to say. I mean, if we want to look at it as a contest between hegemons in China and the US, then it could serve as a way to pull in. It could be using economics and friendship as a way of pulling countries into orbit, while at the same time it's win-win because it promotes China's economic positioning. It gets, you know, Chinese telecommunication companies greater exposure, etc., etc. But I think that's a difficult path, and I think for some countries, what China shouldn't do and what the US shouldn't do is make countries choose. And I think nobody wants to choose, whether they be Uzbekistan or whether they be Singapore or anything else. Nobody wants to choose. They want to be able to be friends with both sides. You know, this is going to be difficult. But as I said, if China can do the soft power well, it can really reap geopolitical gains. And I think that's where the true power in the Belt and Road, or if you want to flip it, the true worry for the US lies.
Michael, go with you.
Again, I think Brian has made great points. I just add very quick, just supplement what compliments what Brian has said. A couple of points. First, the Belt and Road is written into Chinese constitution, and it's President Xi Jinping's signature policy. So in the years to come, China will insist on it and will push forward. And second, it just reminds me, you know, the Chairman Mao Zedong's strategy back 60, 70 years ago is the countryside surrounds the city, right? So basically now, you know, China has to find, if China wants to get power, so it's to find where it grow its power. So the question must be, the issue must be from countryside, that is from those Belt and Road countries. For many years, the Western powers don't even care to give a serious look. So that is clear one way for China to spread its power. But third, I just want to say, you know, a lot of saying China tries to spread its authoritarian features along Belt and Road, I don't think it's true. Personally, I don't think it's true. Because if you look at Chinese culture, for thousands of years, Chinese culture is always holds opinion. Look, Chinese culture is superior, right? Whatever outside the Great War are barbarians, right? It holds itself as superior and made of the kingdom. But at the same time, Chinese culture never even cares to spread its features outside of Great War. So basically, the mentality is, okay, we have a superior culture. If you like it, you admire it, come to learn and be a pupil, right? Be a student, learn it. But if you do not care, if you think this is bad, then I have no interest in spreading this culture to your culture. That's fine. If that's your own choice. So again, if you look at Belt and Road, China basically says, look, I want to come to invest. If I want to do it, let's do it. If you don't want to do it, that's fine. Nobody wants to force anybody to do anything. So I think that is probably more closer to reality. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Michael, for reminding us the history and also the culture. And I think history and culture has a long-standing impact and goes a long way. And with that, I think it's perfect that position for us to conclude this panel. And Brian, sorry, I asked you a tough question, but we're here to deal with tough questions, including the internet, which we're less capable of dealing with. It's unfortunate that we can't actually hear from Professor Kong due to internet issues, but Professor Kong has agreed to record his presentation again, so we can edit the presentation part at least, and then to share with all of you. And please join me thanking the distinguished panel for the fantastic discussion. And I really learned a lot. I hope you do as well. And if you want to follow up with your questions with the speakers, please do so. And thanks again, Brian, Michael, for joining us today. And thank you, the audience and participants, for your participation and your questions. I hope I have time to address all of the questions. But I can only do a few within the time limit. And thanks again. And we will be in touch once the recording is online. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.